In the spring of 1221, a desperate prince named Jalal ad-Din stood in the mountain passes of Afghanistan and made a decision that should have resulted in his annihilation. Behind him lay the smoking ruins of the Khwarazmian Empire, the wealthiest civilization in Central Asia, now reduced to mass graves and pyramids of skulls by Genghis Khan's armies. Every major city from Samarkand to Bukhara had been systematically erased, their populations slaughtered down to the last child. Jalal ad-Din's father, the Shah, had fled like a coward and died on a desolate island, leaving his son to face the Mongol storm alone. Now, with barely 30,000 soldiers scraped together from the survivors, Jalal ad-Din faced a Mongol army that had never lost a major battle. But instead of fleeing like every other commander had done, instead of keeping his cavalry mobile to match Mongol speed, Jalal ad-Din ordered something insane. He commanded his horsemen to dismount, to abandon their horses, and to stand in formation as foot archers alongside his infantry. Every military principle screamed that this was suicide. To understand the absolute audacity of this decision, you must understand what the Mongols had already done to anyone who dared resist them. The Khwarazmian Empire in 1219 had been a superpower. Its cities were architectural marvels, with populations reaching hundreds of thousands. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Persian craftsmanship could produce. When Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to establish peaceful relations, the Khwarazmian governor of Otrar didn't just reject the offer, he executed the Mongol ambassadors and merchants, killing roughly 150 men. The Shah Muhammad II compounded this catastrophic error by endorsing his governor's actions. Genghis Khan's response was methodical extermination. The Mongol invasion force of roughly 200,000 warriors moved with supernatural coordination, besieging multiple cities simultaneously despite being separated by hundreds of miles of desert. Samarkand, with its 400,000 inhabitants, fell in 5 days. The Mongols executed every single inhabitant except for 30,000 artisans they enslaved. Bukhara, the center of Islamic learning, was burned to ashes after its entire population was marched onto the steppes to die. The brutality wasn't random violence, it was calculated terror. At Nishapur, after a Mongol prince was killed during the siege, Genghis Khan ordered the complete obliteration of the city. When it fell, the Mongols spent 6 full days killing. They didn't just kill soldiers, they methodically executed every man, woman, child, and animal in the city. Contemporary sources claim 1,700,000 people died, though modern historians estimate the actual number around 200,000, which is still an almost incomprehensible massacre. The Mongols built pyramids from the severed heads, organizing them by gender, men's skulls in one pyramid, women's in another, children's in a third. At Merv, which may have been the largest city in the world with 700,000 to 1 million inhabitants, the Mongols promised mercy if the city surrendered. When the gates opened, they spent 13 days killing every inhabitant except for 400 artisans. A woman who had escaped by hiding among corpses later walked through the ruins counting bodies. She reached 1,300,000 before giving up. The Khwarazmian Empire, which had taken centuries to build, was erased from existence in less than 2 years. Jalal ad-Din had watched this apocalypse consume everything he knew. He was roughly 30 years old, a prince who had been trained in warfare since childhood, but nothing could prepare anyone for what the Mongols represented. His father, the Shah, had completely collapsed psychologically when the Mongols invaded. Instead of organizing resistance, Muhammad II had fled from city to city in abject terror. Abandoning his people to massacre, he eventually reached a small island in the Caspian Sea where he died of pneumonia and despair, having literally run himself to death. Jalal ad-Din refused to follow his father's cowardly example. As the empire disintegrated, he gathered what forces he could, mostly survivors from destroyed cities, refugees who had lost everything, soldiers whose families had been murdered before their eyes. These were not professional troops. They were traumatized men driven by vengeance and the knowledge that they had absolutely nothing left to lose. Jalal ad-Din led them toward Afghanistan, hoping the mountains might slow the Mongol advance, might give him terrain advantages that could offset the enemy's superior numbers and terrifying mobility. The Mongol force pursuing him was commanded by Shigi Kutuk, one of Genghis Khan's adopted sons and a veteran commander who had participated in countless victories. His army numbered roughly 30,000 warriors, perfectly trained horse archers who had been fighting together for decades. Mongol warriors trained from childhood, learning to ride before they could walk, mastering the composite bow that could shoot arrows through armor at 200 yards. Each warrior maintained a string of horses, usually 4 or 5 mounts, allowing them to cover 100 miles in a single day by rotating between fresh horses. Their tactics were devastatingly effective. They would advance in loose formations, showering enemies with arrows while staying just out of weapon range, never committing to direct combat until the enemy formation broke. Then they would feign retreats, drawing pursuers into ambushes where the real Mongol army waited. Armies that tried to hold defensive positions would be surrounded and starved. Armies that tried to match Mongol mobility would be run into exhaustion and destroyed. It seemed impossible to defeat them. Every European, Chinese, and Islamic commander who had faced them had failed. But Jalal ad-Din had observed something crucial in the pattern of Mongol victories. They always won through mobility and archery. They never engaged in prolonged close combat if they could avoid it. Their power came from movement, from being able to shoot and maneuver simultaneously, from controlling engagement distance. So Jalal ad-Din developed a strategy that seemed completely insane, but might be the only possible counter. When his scouts reported the Mongol army approaching through the Parwan Valley in late 1221, Jalal ad-Din positioned his force with the mountains at his back, eliminating any possibility of retreat. Then he did something unprecedented. He ordered his cavalry to dismount. Roughly 20,000 horsemen, trained their entire lives to fight from horseback, climbed down and formed up as foot archers and infantry. They stood in dense formations, shields locked, archers behind them in ranks. Only 10,000 cavalry remained mounted, positioned on the flanks. The dismounted men were essentially transformed into a human fortress, immobile but concentrated, able to maintain sustained, accurate archery fire without worrying about controlling horses. When Shigi Kutuk arrived and saw this formation, he must have been confused. Every enemy the Mongols had faced tried to match their mobility or hide behind city walls. No one had ever deliberately given up mobility. The battle began with the traditional Mongol approach. Light cavalry advanced in waves, shooting arrows in massive volleys designed to break enemy formations through sheer psychological pressure. The composite bows they used could shoot 15 to 20 arrows per minute, meaning 30,000 Mongol archers could launch 500,000 arrows in the opening minutes of battle. The sound alone was described by survivors as like thunder, a continuous roar as arrows darkened the sky. Against cavalry, this tactic was devastating because horses panic under arrow fire, breaking formations. Against infantry and cities, the Mongols would simply exhaust the defenders, shooting for hours until resistance collapsed. But Jalal ad-Din's dismounted cavalry were different. These were professional warriors, men who had already survived the apocalypse of the Khwarazmian conquest, who had seen entire cities murdered, who had nothing to fear anymore. They locked their shields, absorbed the arrow storm, and maintained formation. More crucially, because they were on foot and didn't need to control horses, they could shoot back with accurate, sustained fire. A mounted archer has to shoot while moving, compensating for horse movement, making long-range accuracy difficult. A foot archer stands stable, aims carefully, shoots methodically. Jalal ad-Din's men began returning fire with disciplined volleys. For the first time in Mongol experience, their arrow tactics weren't working. The Khwarazmian formation wasn't breaking. Men were dying, yes. Arrows were finding gaps in shields, but the survivors closed ranks and kept shooting. The Mongol commander tried the standard feigned retreat tactic, pulling back cavalry units to draw the enemy into pursuit. But Jalal ad-Din had specifically ordered his men not to move under any circumstances. The dismounted troops stayed in formation, shooting at any Mongols who came within range. This was completely outside Mongol tactical doctrine. Usually enemies either broke and ran, making them easy to massacre, or they pursued the feigned retreat into ambushes. Jalal ad-Din's army did neither. They simply stood there, a bristling wall of shields and arrows that wouldn't break and couldn't be baited. Hours passed in this grinding exchange. The Mongols fired until their arrows were depleted, something that rarely happened because battles usually ended long before ammunition ran out. Genghis Khan tried cavalry charges, sending warriors at full gallop toward the Khwarazmian lines. But the dense formation of shields and the accurate fire from stationary archers cut down horses and riders before they could make contact. As the afternoon sun blazed overhead and both armies began to exhaust themselves, Jalal ad-Din saw his moment. The Mongols had committed fully to breaking his center, concentrating their forces in repeated charges against the immobile formation. This left their flanks exposed, stretched thin by the intensity of their assault. Jalal ad-Din signaled his 10,000 mounted cavalry who had been waiting on the wings throughout the entire battle. These men were fresh, their horses rested, and they had watched their dismounted comrades hold against impossible odds for hours. When they charged, they hit the Mongol flanks with devastating force. The Mongols, exhausted from hours of fighting, their arrows depleted, suddenly found themselves caught between the anvil of dismounted infantry in front and the hammer of cavalry crashing into their sides. For the first time in decades of conquest, the Mongols broke. Their formations shattered. Warriors who had never experienced defeat suddenly panicked, trying to disengage, to regroup, but Jalal ad-Din's cavalry gave them no space. The pursuit became a slaughter. Thousands of Mongol warriors, elite soldiers who had conquered empires, died running through mountain passes, cut down from behind or trampled by their own retreating comrades. The casualty figures tell the story of complete Mongol catastrophe. Contemporary sources claim the entire Mongol army was destroyed, though this is likely exaggeration. Modern estimates suggest roughly 10,000 to 15,000 Mongol warriors were killed, captured, or scattered. Genghis Khan himself barely escaped with a fraction of his force. For comparison, the Mongols had lost fewer men conquering the entire Khwarazmian Empire than they lost in this single battle. Jalal ad-Din's casualties were also severe, probably 5,000 to 8,000 dead, but these were losses he could sustain because he had won. The dismounted archer tactic had worked. By sacrificing mobility, by creating an immobile fortress of disciplined archery fire, Jalal ad-Din had negated the Mongol advantage. The foot archers could shoot more accurately and sustain fire longer than mounted archers. The dense infantry formation couldn't be broken by arrow fire alone, and when the Mongols exhausted themselves trying to break this defense, they became vulnerable to the cavalry counterattack. It was brilliant, it was unprecedented, and it should have changed everything. News of the victory spread like wildfire through the Islamic world. For the first time since the Mongol invasions began, someone had defeated them in open battle. Jalal ad-Din was hailed as a hero, a genius commander who had discovered the secret to stopping the unstoppable. Cities that had been preparing to surrender suddenly found courage to resist. Soldiers who had been deserting rallied to Jalal ad-Din's banner. Within weeks, his army swelled to roughly 70,000 men, the largest force assembled against the Mongols since the war began. If Jalal ad-Din could consolidate this army, if he could train more troops in his dismounted archer tactics, he might actually rebuild the Khwarazmian Empire and drive the Mongols back across the steppes. But he had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He had defeated a Mongol army. He had not defeated Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan did not forgive defeats. When word reached the great Khan that Genghis Khan had been beaten, Genghis Khan's response was immediate and absolute. He would personally hunt down Jalal ad-Din and erase him from existence. Genghis Khan arrived with the main Mongol army, roughly 50,000 of his most elite warriors, and began systematically destroying Jalal ad-Din's support. Every city that had rallied to the prince was besieged and annihilated. Every tribe that sent him soldiers was tracked down and massacred. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, covering distances that seemed impossible, appearing at cities before defenders could prepare. Jalal ad-Din found himself constantly retreating, unable to force another major battle because Genghis Khan refused to engage on disadvantageous terms. The great Khan had studied the Battle of Parwan, understood what had happened, and adjusted his tactics. He sent scouts to track Jalal ad-Din's movements, harassed his supply lines, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came at the Indus River in late 1221. Jalal ad-Din's army, now reduced to roughly 30,000 men through attrition and desertion, found itself trapped with the river at their back and Genghis Khan's full force approaching. This time there were no mountains to anchor a defensive position, no terrain advantages to exploit. Jalal ad-Din tried to form his dismounted archer formation again, but Genghis Khan had learned from Shigi Kutuk's mistake. The Mongols didn't engage the center at all. Instead, they swept around the flanks with overwhelming numbers, encircling the entire Khwarazmian army. Jalal ad-Din's cavalry tried to counter, but they were vastly outnumbered. The dismounted archers, immobile by design, couldn't reposition quickly enough to face threats from multiple directions. Within hours, the Khwarazmian formation collapsed into chaos. Warriors tried to flee across the Indus, but the current was swift, and many drowned, weighed down by armor. The Mongols methodically slaughtered those who remained on the bank. Contemporary sources claim 25,000 Khwarazmian soldiers died in the battle and its aftermath, effectively destroying the army that had won at Parwan. But Genghis Khan wasn't satisfied with military victory. He wanted Jalal ad-Din himself. The Mongol cavalry pursued the fleeing prince to the river's edge, where Jalal ad-Din made his last stand. Surrounded by dozens of Mongol warriors with the raging Indus behind him, Jalal ad-Din did something that earned even Genghis Khan's grudging respect. He spurred his horse and leapt off a cliff into the river below, still wearing full armor, still carrying his weapons. The leap was suicidal. The Indus at that point ran through a gorge with cliffs 30 to 40 feet high. Men who jumped into the river wearing armor typically drowned within seconds. But Jalal ad-Din somehow swam, somehow crossed, somehow reached the opposite bank and dragged himself onto shore. Mongol archers shot at him continuously, arrows splashing into the water around him, but none found their mark. When Jalal ad-Din finally reached the far shore and looked back, Genghis Khan himself was standing on the cliff edge watching. According to chroniclers, the great Khan turned to his sons and said, "A son should be like that, acknowledging his enemy's incredible courage, even as he vowed to eventually kill him." Genghis Khan ordered the pursuit to continue, sending scouts across the river. But Jalal ad-Din had vanished into the Indian wilderness. He would spend the next 10 years as a fugitive, wandering from court to court, trying to raise new armies, but he would never again achieve anything close to the victory at Parwan. The Mongols eventually tracked him down in 1231 and killed him in a minor skirmish in Kurdistan. His dismounted archer tactics died with him, lost to history. The tragedy of Parwan is that it proved defeating the Mongols was possible. Jalal ad-Din had discovered a tactical solution that worked. Dismounted archers in disciplined formations could counter Mongol mobility. Dense infantry could absorb arrow storms and maintain position. Cavalry, held in reserve, could exploit Mongol exhaustion. The tactics were sound. They had been proven in battle against elite Mongol forces, and they could have been replicated. But Jalal ad-Din never got the chance to systematize his approach, never built an institutional military structure that could teach these tactics to other armies, never wrote a manual or trained commanders who could spread his methods. When he died, the knowledge died with him. Other commanders who later faced the Mongols had to rediscover similar tactics independently. The Mamluks at Ain Jalut in 1260 would use similar principles, dismounting troops to create stable firing platforms, but they developed these methods through their own analysis, rather than learning from Jalal ad-Din's example. The Battle of Parwan remains one of the great what-ifs of military history. What if Jalal ad-Din had survived to train a generation of commanders? What if his tactics had spread before Genghis Khan could adapt? But perhaps the most brutal irony is that Jalal ad-Din's greatest victory also sealed his fate. If he had simply fled after the Khwarazmian Empire fell, if he had accepted exile in India or Syria, he might have lived a long life as an honored refugee prince. Instead, he chose to resist, achieved the impossible by defeating the Mongols, and thereby guaranteed that Genghis Khan would hunt him relentlessly until he was dead. The victory at Parwan made Jalal ad-Din a target that could never be ignored. Genghis Khan could not allow the defeat to stand, could not let anyone believe the Mongols were beatable, because the entire Mongol Empire was built on the terror of invincibility. Every city that might resist, every army that might fight, every Khan who might rebel, all took courage from the idea that Mongol victory was inevitable. Jalal ad-Din had proven it wasn't inevitable, and for that he had to be destroyed completely, his victory erased and forgotten, his tactics buried with him. The 30,000-foot archers who slaughtered the invincible Mongols became a historical footnote, their incredible achievement overshadowed by the revenge that followed. Genghis Khan ensured that history would remember not Jalal ad-Din's triumph, but his desperate flight and ultimate death.